Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go for more information about the show, as you usually can. If you have checked that out, you know that past episodes of the show are available, as well as social media links and all that kind of good stuff. If you really want to, occasionally we do feature folks who have comments on the show, and you can message or call us at 202-656-6271. I'll be reading one of those messages at the end of the show today. If you're paying constant attention to the news cycle politically in the United States, and I know I am, it's one of my faults, you are aware that, well, gosh, there's a big fight between the Republicans and the Democrats. Again, it's Trump and Biden, and it's the most important election of our lifetimes, and that's important. But to me, I think what is even more critical, because I mean that part is so clearly defined. What is more critical is the fight that is going on within the Democratic Party, between the centrist wing and the left wing of the Democratic Party, at least how it is traditionally cast. And so I thought we would have a conversation about that. And with us to do that is Hunter Walker. He's an investigative reporter at Talking Points Memo. Luppe B. Lupin, a lawyer, reporter, and commentator who lives in New York City. And they have written a book, The Truce, Progressives, Centrists, and the Future of the Democratic Party. Hunter, Luppe, welcome to Facepalm America. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Luppe, Hunter, thank you. So there is a lot made between the fight between the left and center of the Democratic Party, but as near as I can see, and feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, the center always seems to win. So is it really much of a fight?
So that's a really interesting question. And we did see that a lot, particularly in our book. We conducted hundreds of interviews over 2 years with people at every level of the Democratic Party. And we also, specifically looked at two candidates in New York, Yulene New and Alessandra Biaggi, who are really close allies of AOC and sort of ran on her coattails right after that big progressive insurgency. Right. And we watched, as they were sort of ran smack into the headwinds of, Republican dark money and also kind of centrist power. And I think it was a really, really, perfect example of the phenomenon that led to what you're talking about, which is just that, progressives are essentially fighting a two-front war.
Yeah, it almost seems to me, I've heard many people on the left say this, and I'm convinced that it may be true that centrists are more worried about the left wing of the Democratic Party than they are about the Republican Party. Do you think that that's true?
I think it often does seem that way. There's, in our reporting, we sort of ended up dividing the centrists up between mainstream Democrats who are willing to appeal to and work with progressives, and people that we term the radical centrists in the party, who are really, it often seem much more aligned against progressives and unconcerned about Republicans, if not actually working hand in glove with the Republicans. And in the radical centrists we think of are senators like Joe Manchin, Kristen Sinema, increasingly, who do not seem to have any appetite to work with progressives at all. And in writing this book, we interviewed a whole bunch of people up and down, clear across the Democratic Party, and we really think that working with progressives and finding progressive allies has been the key for the other type of mainstream Democrat, the sort of ordinary centrists I was just talking about, to be able to wield power, to come back and get the White House back, defeat Donald Trump, and to pass a major raft of legislation. And that the legislation that the Biden administration passed in its first 2 years, when they had both the House and the Senate, they passed it with progressive allies, and it included a lot of progressive policy goals, a major movement on climate, major movement on prescription drugs, that sort of thing, enabled the passage of a real policy agenda for the Biden White House. And So I think there is a division even amongst the centrist faction of the Democratic Party, amongst people who see the progressives as allies, and people who see the progressives as their arch rivals.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting dynamic, and while there certainly are elements in things that have been passed that are nominally things that the left would like to see passed. My perception is that they are so few and far between, and that two, they're kind of like so many loopholes in them, and that three, there's so many more things that are really critical and urgent, and so many like larger steps that need to be taken to follow up on them, that to me, taken comprehensively, it really does seem like a centrist victory for just very slow progression. If progression is the word that a centrist would want to use. In a lot of the arguments that I hear from centrists on places like MSNBC or other outlets, tends to be along the lines of, well, we've got we're looking towards a general election, and we can't seem too far to the left, and this occurs in this election and many others, and we've got to make an effort to capture moderate voters, so we can't appear too far to the left. For one thing, that seems like very much at odds with the attack that the Republican Party and the MAGA movement in particular has taken. So I think there's some broad strategic questions there, but it also brings to my mind the question of how these centrists, how many of them are really thinking tactically here and wanting to just kind of fly under the radar, or how many of them really just don't endorse ultimately the core tenets that a more progressive wing of the party would tend to endorse.
So there's a ton to unpack there, and I think as we do it, let's travel back to 2020 and some of the stuff that we uncovered in our reporting for this book, and along with Republican and centrist financial advantages that I alluded to, right. And also sort of just establishment power that has served as headwinds for progressives. Another thing we saw was that on the campaign level, there's sometimes centrist consolidation that we just didn't see on the left side of the aisle. And, I'll cite sort of two examples of that. We have some new reporting showing that in 2020, behind the scenes, Barack Obama helped unify the primary field behind Joe Biden as Bernie Sanders was starting to surge.
Right.
We also found that, there was this alleged phone call where Biden reached out to Andrew Cuomo, and this was sort of a pre-scandal Andrew Cuomo, who was considering running for president. And, according to a source close to Cuomo, Biden said, please, you got to stay out, or some leftist, quote unquote, nut could win, right? And so we have seen moderates on the campaign level be effective allies for each other and consolidate and cooperate in a way that I'm not sure we've seen on the left. And once again, those races I was referring to in New York are a great example. I mean, Yolene New, who was endorsed by the Working Families Party, ended up losing to Dan Goldman, who was really a much more center establishment Democrat in a district where arguably there were two other progressives in the field with her, and combined, they had a much larger block of the vote, but they could not consolidate. That being said, just to go further from there, Joe Biden during the 2020 campaign kind of in his consolidation with Cuomo and in other moments, that were not behind the scenes, he explicitly ran as a moderate establishment, traditional alternative to the Bernie Sanders wing of the party, right? And yet, in spite of this, I think he did arguably end up being somewhat more of a progressive than certainly that campaign posture would have indicated. And as he did, pursue what was a more ambitious, what was a more progressive agenda, he had allies on the left of the party, including, Chairman Pramila Jayapal of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And as Luppe was touching on, the Biden agenda ultimately ended up getting eroded by his fellow centrists, your Joe Manchins and your Josh Gottheimers. And I think they were quite calculating in that moment in, targeting their leverage in Congress, to achieve their policy goals. So there is, an effectiveness. One other thing I would touch on is that, one of the ways that we see that the left wing of the party is not unified is within kind of the activists. And so we do a lot of reporting in the book that chronicles the rise of AOC. And you can see the internal debates within the Democratic Socialists of America about whether they should even be participating in races, whether they should be behind her. And I think that sort of thing, is another thing that has hampered the left. Overall, I think, we just went a million places, but the central dynamic here is that Democrats, and I think the left more particularly, are a diverse coalition that actually cares about small d democracy, right? And that poses difficulties that you don't have when you have a more authoritarian approach, and a demographically homogenous white base like Donald Trump. So the chaos in the two parties looks kind of different, right? With the Republicans, we see January 6th, we see, a former president facing unprecedented legal troubles. And with Democrats, we see this diverse coalition that isn't always on the same page.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's certainly, divisions within the left. And I would, point out, too, that there seems to be a pretty big gap between, Biden's agenda and his campaign promises and what ultimately he was really willing to push for in a strong way. And I know that there was opposition, again, from those self-same radical centrists that you mentioned. But, it strikes me that if you compare the primaries side by side, at least on the Republican side, there is an active and open and widely reported on a primary where on the Democratic side, the DNC, and I was talking with Marianne Williamson about this the other day, the fact that they've structured it deliberately so that South Carolina is the first official primary, a much more conservative a state than New Hampshire, and the place where Joe Biden was able to coalesce everything together in 2020, set aside New Hampshire where there were going to presumably be more issues, and there's very little discussion about that whatsoever. And there certainly is a precedent for challenges to a sitting president from within his own party. So I'm wondering if in terms of while I think we all recognize that the Republican Party has a lot of problems with the idea of democracy altogether at this stage, that the DNC and the centrist wing of the party has not exactly always been amenable to it in terms of stepping back from gaming the system a little bit. I'd be interested in getting your response to that.
Well, you touched on something that we were really interested in reporting this book, which is the changes that were made to the DNC's primary calendar, this sort of official calendar that says who gets to go first and who has to wait. And there's a long history in Democratic politics of a sort of desire to reform the order of that calendar. To take a real step back, there used to be an entirely different system of smoke-filled rooms, essentially, where you had party bosses and political power brokers essentially deciding who